When you picture the Middle Ages, you probably imagine knights on horseback, kings in castles, or peasants working in the fields. But what if I told you that none of it, not the markets, not the harvests, not even the wars, would have been possible without the quiet, stubborn strength of donkeys and mules? These humble animals were the true engines of medieval life, carrying food, firewood, and even armies across Europe. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you'll see how creatures we often overlook shaped the survival of entire villages, and why history could never have been written without them. Chapter 1. Beasts of burden in the village economy. When you think about medieval Europe, your imagination may first summon images of castles, knights, or bustling markets. Yet, for most people living in those centuries, life was tied not to the grandeur of nobility, but to the repetitive rhythms of agriculture, small-scale trade, and the struggle to endure each changing season. At the center of that survival stood not only the people themselves, but also the humble animals that carried loads, plowed fields, and connected remote hamlets with the wider world. Among them, donkeys and mules were indispensable. They were not glamorous like the horses prized by knights, yet without them, many villages would have collapsed under the weight of their own daily labor. To understand their role, you must first picture the landscape of a typical medieval village. Fields stretched outward from the cluster of cottages and thatched barns, divided into long strips that peasants cultivated in rotation. Wheat in one, barley in another, while the third lay fallow. The soil had to be plowed, the harvest transported, and wood brought in from the surrounding forests. Every ounce of food, fuel, or resource had to be moved by human or animal muscle. Here, donkeys and mules thrived in a way that horses could not. Horses were expensive. They required oats, which were not cheap, and their upkeep demanded a wealth of resources beyond what many peasants could muster. Donkeys, on the other hand, could survive on rougher fodder, coarse grasses, weeds, and even scraps. They were smaller but sturdy, and they could navigate narrow, muddy village tracks that a horse might stumble upon. Mules, the hybrid offspring of donkeys and horses, combined the endurance of the donkey with some of the strength of the horse. This made them particularly suited to hauling goods over long distances or uneven terrain. Consider the daily work of a medieval household. Grain harvested from the open fields had to be transported to a mill, often located on the estate of the local lord. A donkey fitted with panniers, woven baskets slung over its back, could carry bushels of barley or rye, far more efficiently than a person burdened with sacks. Firewood, essential for cooking and heating, had to be gathered regularly. Donkeys and mules trudged along forest paths, their loads tied carefully with ropes. Without them, peasants would have relied solely on their own backs, exhausting already strained bodies. The mule, in particular, became a symbol of practical endurance in Europe's agricultural world. Records from the 12th and 13th centuries reveal how monasteries, which often acted as centers of agricultural innovation, bred and valued mules for their hardiness. Unlike horses, mules were less prone to illness, lived longer, and could carry greater weights relative to their size. For villages dependent on moving salt, wool, or grain to market towns, the mule train was a lifeline. The importance of these animals extended into the fabric of medieval trade. Villages did not exist in isolation. Even the most self-sufficient farming community needed to barter or sell surplus in local markets. Donkeys and mules formed the bridge between the village and the town. Picture a line of mules trudging along a dirt track, each with sacks of grain balanced carefully on its back. The pace was slow, often no faster than a steady human walk, but reliable. A mule could cover many miles in a day and still carry goods too heavy for any one person. Yet, their role was not purely economic. They carried people too. A peasant walking several miles to a distant village fair might ride his family's donkey, perched awkwardly on a rough blanket or wooden saddle. Women, especially when heavily pregnant or carrying small children, relied on donkeys to transport them safely across uneven ground. In regions with hilly terrain, such as parts of Spain or Italy, donkeys were so embedded in daily life that they became almost extensions of the household. As familiar as the family dog might be today, the medieval imagination also took note of these beasts. Donkeys appeared in religious art and scripture, depicted as humble yet symbolic creatures. The biblical story of Christ riding a donkey into Jerusalem reinforced the animal's association with modesty and endurance. To medieval villagers, this imagery resonated with their daily reality. The donkey was not noble but necessary, a creature that bore the literal burdens of survival. Still, life for these animals was not gentle. Working animals endured long hours, harsh treatment, and often meager food. Donkeys, though hardy, could suffer under heavy loads, especially when poorly cared for. Their hooves wore down on stony paths, and without proper maintenance, lameness could set in. Medieval sources mention laws and church teachings urging owners not to overburden their beasts, though in practice, survival often outweighed compassion. Yet, there is evidence, too, of care. Villagers knew the value of their donkeys and mules, and a sick or dead animal could spell economic disaster for a household. If you walked through a medieval village at dawn, you would likely hear the braying of donkeys echoing between cottages before you heard the clatter of church bells. Farmers prepared their animals alongside their tools, strapping on wooden yokes or balancing baskets across the back. Children were sent to fetch water, with a donkey carrying barrels slung over its sides, while older men loaded carts for journeys to the manor or the town. The animals were part of the rhythm, their presence woven into the ordinary sounds and smells of daily life. Beyond agriculture, donkeys and mules shaped broader networks of medieval Europe. Pilgrimages, which drew thousands across the continent, depended on animals for transport. A pilgrim too poor to afford a horse often traveled with a donkey, carrying bedding and provisions tied in bundles. Merchants transporting goods across the Alps or Pyrenees relied on mule caravans, climbing switchback trails where wheeled carts could not go. Even armies employed these beasts, not for charging into battle, but for carrying supplies, sacks of flour, barrels of water, or tents needed for campaigns. Their role was so critical that disputes sometimes arose over their use. In manorial records, fines were levied against peasants who damaged another's donkey or overloaded a shared mule. In towns, regulations specified how much weight an animal could legally carry to prevent abuse and ensure efficiency. These small details, tucked into medieval legal codes, show just how embedded these creatures were in the machinery of daily survival. Yet, while donkeys and mules were indispensable, they rarely received the admiration afforded to horses. Knights wrote poetry about their steeds, lords named their prize stallions, and war horses were buried with honors. Donkeys, meanwhile, brayed in the background, unnamed and largely unnoticed. Still, their absence would have been catastrophic. Without their patient endurance, villages could not have sustained themselves, nor could trade and communication have flourished. So when we think about what kept medieval Europe functioning, beyond kings, battles, or grand cathedrals, it is worth pausing to consider the simple donkey grazing in a village pasture or the mule trudging steadily along a rutted path. Their quiet labor carried the weight of an entire society, even if that society seldom sang their praises. And yet, one question lingers as we move deeper into their story. If donkeys and mules were so vital, what did their daily care, training, and treatment look like? And how did villagers balance their dependence on these animals with the demands of their own survival? Chapter 2. Care, Training, and the Daily Burden of Beasts. To truly understand how donkeys and mules sustained medieval villages, you need to look not just at what they carried, but how they were managed. Unlike today, where machines dominate agricultural and transport work, the Middle Ages relied on living creatures, animals that ate, rested, fell ill, and required careful handling. A donkey or mule was not just a tool, but an investment, one that demanded attention, patience, and a certain amount of skill to keep alive and useful. feeding the beasts. One of the first considerations for any peasant or smallholder was food. Donkeys, unlike horses, did not require rich grain to stay healthy. This alone made them invaluable to families who could scarcely spare their oats for an animal. Instead, donkeys thrived on coarse grasses, hay, weeds, and even the rougher stalks left after grain was harvested. In southern Europe, where olive groves and vineyards spread across rocky soil, donkeys grazed among the scrubby plants that would never have fed a horse. Mules required somewhat more care, but shared the donkey's ability to survive on modest fodder. They could chew their way through thorny bushes or eat dried straw left over from threshing. This adaptability meant that even in years of poor harvests, when food scarcity pressed heavily on human and animal alike, donkeys and mules stood a better chance of survival than horses. For a peasant household, this mattered greatly. If the animal endured the lean winter, so too did the family's ability to work and trade the following year. Housing and shelter. How were these animals kept? Archaeological and written records suggest that in many villages, donkeys and mules were housed in simple byres or barns, often attached to cottages so their warmth would seep through thin walls into the family's living quarters. The smell of manure was constant, but it was part of life. At night, animals might be tethered indoors, not only to protect them from theft, but also to keep them safe from wolves or roaming dogs. In some areas, particularly in the Mediterranean, animals might be stabled in caves or carved out spaces in hillsides, natural shelters that provided coolness in summer and warmth in winter. Elsewhere, rough lean-tos of wood and thatch sufficed. These shelters were far from luxurious, but they reflected the practical balance of medieval life, just enough to keep the animal alive and functional, never so much as to waste resources, training and handling, unlike war horses, which were trained through elaborate rituals and sometimes even celebrated in poetry. Donkeys and mules were handled with a plainer, more practical discipline. Young donkeys were broken in gradually, usually by tying small loads to their backs and allowing them to walk alongside older, experienced animals. This slow method ensured they grew accustomed to weight and to the rhythm of village work without being frightened or harmed. Mules, prized for their strength, were often trained for carrying heavy burdens up steep terrain or pulling carts where roads permitted. Because mules inherited a certain stubbornness from their donkey lineage, they required patience. Medieval texts occasionally note this trait. A mule would not move if it sensed danger or an unreasonable demand, and beating it often produced no better result. Thus, while harshness was common, successful handlers learned that persistence and calm guidance worked better than force. This, perhaps, explains why donkeys gained a reputation for stubbornness. In truth, they were cautious, reluctant to step into terrain that looked unsafe, or to bear a load that exceeded their strength. While this trait frustrated their owners, it may also have saved many a villager from disaster. A cart stuck in mud or a peasant injured by an overturned load was of little use to anyone. The donkey's hesitance, while irritating, often prevented such accidents. The weight of burdens. How much could these animals realistically carry? A healthy donkey could bear up to 100 kilograms of goods, though most loads were kept lighter to preserve endurance. Mules, stronger and larger, could carry even more, sometimes twice that amount over long distances. When you imagine lines of mules carrying sacks of salt, wine barrels, or bundles of wool, it becomes clear how villages tied into larger trade networks. A single caravan of 10 or 20 mules could transport enough goods to stock a market stall or supply a monastery. In villages, though, the loads were humbler. A child perched atop a donkey while 2 baskets of vegetables balanced on either side was a common sight. Firewood tied into bundles, water barrels sloshing, or sheaves of hay formed the daily burden of these animals. Such loads were not dramatic, but they were essential, and they accumulated into the fabric of survival, illness, injury, and remedies. Animals that worked hard inevitably fell ill or suffered injuries. Donkeys and mules were no exception. Lameness from worn hooves, sores from poorly fitted harnesses, and digestive troubles from poor quality feed were recurring problems. Veterinary care in the Middle Ages was rudimentary, yet it existed. Manuals of the time included sections on the treatment of livestock, prescribing herbal remedies or ointments for wounds. For hoof problems, ash mixed with fat might be applied. For sore backs, cloth padding was sometimes stuffed under saddles or harnesses, though often only after injury had already occurred. In monasteries where literacy and medical knowledge concentrated, some monks kept records of animal care, blending classical veterinary wisdom from Roman authors with local practice. Despite this, many animals suffered through neglect or sheer necessity. A peasant family could ill afford to rest their donkey for weeks if work had to be done. The animal's health was weighed against the family's own survival, and often survival won. Still, the evidence of legal codes and church sermons, admonitions not to overwork beasts, or fines for cruelty, suggests that people recognized the need to balance use with care, emotional bonds. Did medieval villagers feel affection for their donkeys and mules? The historical record is sparse, but glimpses exist. Folklore and religious texts sometimes portrayed donkeys as humble companions, echoing biblical stories. Illuminated manuscripts occasionally depicted donkeys in nativity scenes with gentle faces, symbols of patience and service. It is likely that many villagers, especially children, grew fond of these beasts that shared their daily lives, but affection was tempered by pragmatism. These were working animals, essential but expendable. A sick animal was a tragedy because it threatened survival, not because of sentimentality. And yet, one suspects that in the quiet of a smoky barn, or in the tired smile of a farmer patting a donkey's neck after a long day, moments of bond and familiarity existed. Even if they rarely entered the official record, donkeys and the church's influence extended into the treatment of animals too. Preachers occasionally used donkeys in sermons as symbols of humility, endurance, or stubbornness. Festivals in parts of Europe even featured the Feast of the Donkey, a celebration where donkeys were led into churches, sometimes in mock reenactments of biblical events. While partly satirical, these festivals reveal how deeply woven into daily thought the donkey had become. In religious art, the donkey stood alongside oxen at the stable of Bethlehem, silent witnesses to divine birth. For villagers, seeing their humble animal sanctified in paint or song may have given dignity to the otherwise ordinary creature tied outside their cottage. The balance of dependence in every respect. Donkeys and mules were part of a delicate balance. Villagers relied on them for transport, trade, and labor. In return, they offered modest care, shelter, and feed. The animals endured heavy loads and long days, but they also ensured that villages functioned with some measure of stability. Their presence allowed peasants to carry firewood to their hearths, grain to their mills, and goods to their markets. Without them, the burden would have fallen entirely on human shoulders, a weight that would have made medieval survival even harsher. Still, questions linger. If donkeys and mules were so integral to village life, how did their role change when society shifted, when trade expanded, roads improved, or wars swept across the land? Did these humble beasts remain essential, or did they slowly give way to other forms of transport and labor as the Middle Ages unfolded? Chapter 3. Trade, War, and the Shifting Role of Beasts. By now, you understand that donkeys and mules carried not only firewood and food, but the very weight of medieval survival. Yet their role stretched beyond the local village. They were threads in the broader fabric of Europe's economy, transport systems, and even its wars. To study them is to trace the hidden arteries of the Middle Ages, lines of burdened animals winding through markets, fields, and roads, shaping history in ways that were rarely recorded yet deeply felt. Donkeys and mules in the web of trade. Markets and fairs were central to medieval life. Villagers brought their goods, wool, grain, cheese, firewood, and returned with salt, tools, or cloth. Donkeys and mules were the silent facilitators of this exchange. A peasant could load baskets of apples onto a donkey's back and make the journey to the weekly market, selling enough to pay a tax or buy a needed pot on a larger scale. Mules became indispensable to merchants traveling greater distances. Salt caravans in southern France, wine traders in Spain, and wool merchants in Italy all relied on strings of mules. The mule's endurance made it particularly suited for mountainous terrain, where carts could not go and human backs could not bear the strain. Trade routes expanded across regions, and so too did the presence of these animals. Ports bustled with goods brought down from inland towns by mule caravans. Pilgrims trekking to Santiago de Compostela often rented donkeys for carrying supplies. In these ways, humble beasts supported not just daily subsistence, but the entire circulation of goods and people. The role of donkeys and mules in warfare, though not as famous as war horses, donkeys and mules played a quiet role in medieval military campaigns. Armies on the move needed food, weapons, tents, and equipment, and it was rarely knights who carried them. Mules were the backbone of logistics, hauling supplies across rough landscapes. Chroniclers mention long lines of pack animals trailing behind armies, essential yet almost invisible in the heroic accounts of battle. Crusading armies, in particular, relied heavily on pack animals. The long journeys from Europe to the Holy Land demanded beasts that could survive poor feed and hot climates. Donkeys and mules, hardy and adaptable, often filled this role more reliably than horses. Without them, soldiers would have starved or been left without arms far from home. Still, their presence was precarious. Disease, lack of fodder, or theft could devastate an army's logistics. The quiet collapse of supply lines, often carried on the backs of donkeys and mules, could determine the fate of campaigns more than the clash of swords. Symbolism and perceptions, beyond work and war, donkeys held symbolic weight. Medieval sermons often contrasted the proud horse with the humble donkey, casting the latter as a symbol of humility. Christ's entry into Jerusalem on a donkey reinforced this image in the Christian imagination. Mules, too, featured in moral writings, sometimes praised for strength, other times dismissed as sterile creatures, useful but unnatural hybrids. Villagers lived somewhere between these abstractions and practical reality. They valued donkeys and mules for what they could do, yet they could not ignore the stories and sermons that shaped attitudes. When peasants led their donkeys to market or monks painted them in manuscripts, the animal became part of a cultural language that blurred daily survival with religious and moral meaning. Decline and transition. As Europe shifted in the later Middle Ages, the role of donkeys and mules began to change. Improved roads in some regions made wheeled carts more practical, drawn by oxen or horses. Towns expanded, and with them grew demand for larger-scale transport. Horses, once too expensive for peasants, became more accessible as breeding improved and economies grew. Yet donkeys and mules did not disappear. They remained essential in mountainous or marginal areas where roads stayed rough and farms poor. Southern Europe, in particular, continued to rely on them for centuries. Even today, in some Mediterranean villages, donkeys can still be seen navigating narrow streets or rocky paths, echoes of a medieval rhythm. The decline was uneven, shaped by geography and economy. In rich valleys and plains, carts and horses rose in prominence. On hillsides and rocky coasts, the donkey remained a stubborn survivor, the legacy of burden. What lingers when you step back is the recognition that medieval survival rested not only on lords, kings, and castles, but on creatures like donkeys and mules. They seldom entered chronicles unless in passing, yet they bore the weight of history on their backs. Each sack of grain brought to a mill, each bundle of firewood hauled from a forest, each jug of wine carried to a monastery. These were the real engines of survival. Donkeys and mules embodied endurance. They were not glorious. They did not fight battles or symbolize power, but they carried on, quietly and steadily, enabling societies to function. Without them, peasants' lives would have been far harsher, markets emptier, and armies weaker. Reflection, a forgotten partnership. Today, when machines do the work of carrying, plowing, and hauling, it is easy to forget how much rested on these patient animals. Yet as you imagine a medieval village, the smoke rising from thatched cottages, the clatter of hooves on cobblestone, the creak of a wooden cart, you cannot separate the image from the donkey and the mule. They were not admired like knights or celebrated like saints, but they were necessary. And in their necessity lies their legacy. Perhaps the real question is not why medieval villages needed them, but why we have forgotten just how much of history they carried. Thank you for spending this quiet moment of history with me here on Quiet Boring Sleep. If you found comfort in this story and would like more gentle journeys into the forgotten corners of the past, please remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these calming histories alive, and it means we can share even more stories to help you drift peacefully into rest. Until next time, sleep well and dream quietly.